Hindi ako marunong gumawa ng mga event kasi. Ganyan. Okay. So ano na, radio silent na lahat. Ako na lang yung naka-on. Sige, I'll turn it off. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Studying Discourses in the Time of COVID, the public presentation of student research projects conducted for the class Anthro 194, or Research Methods in Linguistic Anthropology. These projects were conducted over the second semester of the current school year, 2020 to 2021, and focused on topics relating to local discourses and experiences from the past year in the time of the pandemic. I'm Monica Santos from the UP Department of Anthropology, instructor for Anthro 194 this past semester. This event is brought to you by the Linguistic Anthropology Resource Center of the UP Department of Anthropology. So today we'll have two sets of presentations. This morning's presentation will feature projects of students in section THV, which examine discourses that relate to parenting, forwarded messages, news headlines, and commonly used terms during the pandemic. Before we begin the presentations, I just want to remind our participants in the room to keep their mic muted and their video off. We will have an open forum after all the groups have presented. So if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat box. And for our viewers on Facebook, you can participate in the discussion in the comment section. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge my students, no, especially our guests who participated in the different research projects, and also our viewers on Facebook. No? Thank you for your contributions to the discussion today. Okay, so our first presentation is from Nicole Barba, Alyssandra Costa, Mikka Palisoc, and Aundrei Villaraza. They examined video content that reflect parental discourse on COVID. Today with us are Alyssandra and Aundrei. Papakita yata sila ng konti. Saglit. Are they here? Wala pa. Okay, they will join us later. Ayan, they're here. Ayan. Alyssandra. Is Aundrei here? Not yet.
Not yet po.
Ayan. Okay, sige. So, that's Alyssandra. She's a member of the group, no? Okay. Sige. So, the title of their project is Pandemic Parenting: How Parents Construct Information During the Pandemic.
A moment po.
Everybody.
Naririnig po ba?
Today we'll be talking
Hello? Can the audio be heard?
how parents construct information about the pandemic for their children. As presented by Barba, Aleeza Costa, Mikka Palisoc, and
Yes, it's just medyo mahina lang.
this discussion will be divided into 4 parts: the introduction, the research questions, methodology, and the findings and analysis. On March 9, 2020, the Department of Education announced a 1-week suspension of classes as approved by the President. During such time, there were no enforced protocols in place. However, households were still suggested to continue staying at home and not go out unless absolutely necessary. This 1-week suspension included another week and then another week. After the week of suspension, the IATF, or the Interagency Task Force, finally put out an omnibus guideline on what to do during this pandemic and how quarantine is supposed to take place. It is directly stated in the IATF's guidelines that persons below 16 years of age are considered part of the vulnerable population and are not allowed outside of their homes unless justifiably necessary. So children were told to stay home. These are all underneath the enhanced community quarantine a term that was created primarily for the pandemic to indicate the intensity level of quarantine imposed in a given place. So with the emergence of these new words within the context of the pandemic in the Philippines, it becomes a concern whether or not all of these new additions to the language are in fact understood by those who hear it. Primarily, this study will focus on comprehension of children during this time. This study aims to see how parents have taken on the challenge of explaining the pandemic to their children. Do the children comprehend the gravity of the situation? Are their parents able to inform them of the rules and protocols set forth by the government?
For our research questions, we have the following to guide the analysis of the research study. Number 1, how do parents communicate information to their child or children regarding particular measures during the pandemic? And the second one, is there more emphasis in things such as hygiene, staying at home, health, etc. by the parents to their child or children? If there is, how did the pandemic impact such discourse in becoming more relevant than before?
Now for the methodology used in conducting the study. First, during the data collection, one of the sources of the study came from a social media platform. Though it is made available and accessible for the public, it was not on the awareness of the content owner that her uploaded video would be used to aid the researchers. So there was a need for consent. The video owner was contacted through her social media account and agreed to use her uploaded video for the study. Informed consent was also asked from the other parents, and they agreed to take full participation in the study. However, due to the limitation of the situation, the researchers only looked for participants residing near them. Next is data instruments. First, we used YouTube video as one of our data instruments. A video was found available on the said platform, showing a child being asked by her mother about his understanding of the pandemic. The video was constructed portraying genre features of an interview where a series of questions are asked by a moderator or the interviewer and are answered by the participant. Since the video content showcased interaction between the chosen speech community, the parent and the child was asked about his view on pandemic, the video became helpful to the study to see how language is used by the adults or parents during the pandemic and became effective to the understanding of the children. We are asked to keep in mind that the uploaded video is a mediated content, where the content owner has the authority to choose the parts she would want the public to see. Therefore, the interaction that can be witnessed in the video may not be as authentic as an everyday interaction between the parents and children would be. With this, we try to ask for the consent of the content owner to be interviewed so we can analyze the context, avoiding misinterpretation from our own assumptions, and for us to know the motivations behind the uploading of the videos. Unfortunately, she only agreed to use the video she uploaded and refused to be interviewed. We also use interview questions as our data instrument. An interview guide was formulated based on the questions this study aims to answer. Two parents were interviewed and asked about how they educate or explain the pandemic to their children. Questions also lead to answering how pandemic affected the discourse between parents and children. For example, they were asked how often they remind their children about their hygiene before and now, how their children respond to their reminders before the pandemic and now.
For our analytical method, we employ discourse analysis to zoom in on the particular ways in which parents convey critical information to their children about the pandemic. Through discourse analysis, we were able to explore how parents use language in communicating information about the pandemic to their children, as well as the social context of the existing information during the pandemic and the manner in which parents transfer this to their children. For the next part, we present the findings and analysis of the research study. The YouTube video showcased Yuan, a 6-year-old boy being interviewed by his mother regarding his understanding of the pandemic. In the video, Yuan is asked a series of questions by the mother in the entire 4-minute duration of the clip. The questions asked by the mother were about the pandemic, such as ano ang COVID-19? Ano ang dapat gawin pag may COVID-19? Umiinom ka ba ng vitamins? Ano ang sasabihin mo sa mga batang nanonood? Kung may pray ka, anong ipepray mo? Among others. These questions are an attempt to communicate to the child information about the pandemic and specific actions that need to be taken for safety measures. It is possible that prior to shooting the video, the information provided by the child is rehearsed, or perhaps a consequence of constant reminder and advice of the mother to the child. It does not necessarily mean that what the video shows is how normally the parent would advise the child, hence making the YouTube clip a mediated content. The series of questions presented in the video clip is clearly motivated by the current discourse that perpetuates in the time of the pandemic. With the virus posing a health crisis, there has become an emphasis not just on physical health, but also in emotional and mental well-being. The series of questions asked by the mother highlights this discourse during the pandemic concerning health, especially health and well-being of members of the family. In comparison to the YouTube video, a mother of a 6-year-old son we interviewed mentioned that they, her husband, and she had to explain to their child what the virus is and what it does, because they understand that as a child, he would want to spend time outside. They had to explain by also using videos that are made for kids explaining COVID-19 and the pandemic that things will change from that point on. There will be no going outside for a while. They must regularly wash their hands, eat healthy foods, and especially wear face masks. Unlike what the YouTube video showed, the parents in this case informed their child about the pandemic by directly explaining what the pandemic is and what is required of them to do regarding it. The mother said they explained it by saying, may virus na hindi ito kontrolado ng kahit sino. Wala tayong magagawa about it. Kailangan natin protektahan yung sarili natin kasi wala pang gamot. The mother also mentioned that they showed videos about the virus and the pandemic to para maramdaman niya yung gravity na nangyayari at para maintindihan niya na kailangan mag-ingat. In explaining the information about the pandemic and the virus to the child, the mother said they had to keep it simple because pag masyadong marami, mas mahirap. Also to ensure that the child is really absorbing what he needs to do because according to them, kahit sabihin mo mang mahirap, okay nang mas OA. Parang better be safe than sorry. On the other hand, a mother of 5 children mentioned that she also explains to her children what to do and what not to do in a pandemic, but only if an occasion where there is a need for it arises. According to the mother, when she sees her children soiled or grubby is the time she reminds them that there is a virus and that they must be clean at all times. An opportunity to teach the children about the pandemic and the virus arises as well when they answer modules for school. The mother said she and her children talk about the virus and the pandemic when they do modular activities for the children's school, most likely because there is also information provided in the modules by the school about the virus and the pandemic. It is apparent that information about the virus and the pandemic are being communicated well to the children, but spontaneity in this case makes it quite different from the other cases. Reminders made in situations that call for such are subtle in giving away information about the virus and the pandemic. Utterances are constructed in a declarative form with an implication of an imperative purpose, as marked by the statement of the mother, alam niyo namang may COVID, nagdudumi na naman kayo. In making a statement about the situation, the mother is also trying to give an order to the children to do something, which in this case to wash and clean themselves.
We proceed to the second research question that our group has come up with. Now we will look into the information that we have gathered to determine whether there is emphasis in things such as hygiene, staying at home, health, and etc. in exchanges between parents and their children during the pandemic.
and how the pandemic impacted such discourse in becoming more relevant now than before. From the interviews conducted, the recurring communicative acts are imperative utterances that give emphasis on hygiene, staying at home, wearing masks, and sanitizing via alcohol. These types of discourses between the interviewed parents and their children became more prevalent during the pandemic compared to how it was before, as these utterances are part of the bigger D discourse of life under COVID-19 in the Philippines. According to Taylor, in her work, What is Discourse Analysis in 2013, discourse analysis goes into how language can be used as an evidence to a phenomenon beyond the individual person, providing the bigger picture of a social phenomenon. Given this, the discourses prevalent in parent-child exchanges during the pandemic are: number 1, lifestyle discourses; number 2, public health and health promotion discourses; and number 3, just the overall collective understandings. So for lifestyle discourses, an example can be found in the interview we had with the mother of 5 children, where the interviewee mentioned about changes in diet and how her kids prefer eating vegetables now compared to the time before the pandemic, saying, ngayon mahilig na sila sa gulay. And number 2, an example of this is can be found in the interview we had with the mother of the 6-year-old boy, where she said in the interview that she really utilizes videos purposely made by health institutions for children to understand about the pandemic. And what she does is she shows it to her child, saying, nagpakita kami ng mga videos na pangbata na nag-explain tungkol sa virus or pati na yung mga nangyayari sa buong mundo. Ipinakita namin talaga sa kanya para maramdaman niya yung gravity ng nangyayari at para maintindihan niya na kailangan mag-ingat, laging maging malinis, saka hindi talaga pwedeng lumabas, lalo na ang mga batang katulad niya. And number 3, for the collective understandings, inherent in phrases like syempre kailangan and mahirap na talaga, kaya kailangan, is the ideology of what the parent believes to be the general truth, that if one follows this or that rule, that person will ideally remain safe because the virus will not infect that person, showing through language the ethics or the collective morals on what to do and what not to do, being embedded onto the children. It is interesting to note that despite the ethics intrinsic in the practices being taught to the children, discourses surrounding the health crisis is still very much individualistic from the viewpoint of health as a responsibility of an individual person rather than the responsibility of the collective whole. On your screens, you can see from the lines, may virus na, hindi ito kontrolado, wala tayong magagawa about it, and kailangan lang natin protektahan yung sarili natin. It very much aligns with what Taylor mentioned in the chapter 3 of her work regarding Bell's discourse analysis on a health and illness crisis on cancer prevention. That in contrast to an environmental crisis, the nature of health-related discourses zooms into putting the responsibility upon an individual instead of a broader scope. The styles of speaking between parents and their children, as we have noted, mainly from the video that we included in our research and during some bits in the interviews we had, there are also linguistic features from the exchanges that are evidently distinguishable from other speech communities. Under the confines of a mediated video and an interview setup, the parents who participated in the research speak to their children using softer tones and a euphemised word choice. Just like how people naturally take longer time to digest information they're not that familiar with, the slower speaking style of parents towards their children suggests how children may be viewed as blank slates who take longer time to have a firm grasp of certain situations they have little to no experience and awareness of in the past as compared to other age groups. And now for the conclusion of our study, We witnessed many changes occurring at the onset of the pandemic. The livelihood of many people were affected. Daily lives have been altered in relation to required health protocols. Normal functioning has been impacted, and we are all forced to adjust because what's at stake are lives. In particular, households had to recalibrate to accommodate the transitions occurring during the pandemic. We observe that there have been prevalence in particular discourses caused by the changes that occurred and are occurring during the pandemic. Parents have to put more emphasis on reminding their children about sanitation and hygiene, to eat more vegetables, to always disinfect, and to wear masks when going out or when there are other people in the house. It is for this reason that parents have to adopt ways that would help their children understand the changes that are happening today. They're being emphatic about precautions and reminders on the children regarding the virus and the pandemic, either through an explanation, a provisional video, a spontaneous warning, or a form of interview or cross-examination, are the parents' ways of guiding and leading their children along the changing circumstances and their ways of showing concern. Because as shown in the screen, as parents, it is an automatic response to look after their children, especially at times when social processes are shifting in an overwhelming degree. That ends our presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Alyssandra, no, for your presentation. And of course, to your group mates also, no, congratulations on that. Okay, so our next presentation, hold on. Okay. Yeah. So our next presentation is from Dominic Cordero, Danielle Casipit, Moira Tiongson, and Precious Echague. They're all here today. Tama ba? Sige, pakita kayo. Ayan. Dalawa lang ba? Just the two of you? Ayan, si Moira. Danielle's not here? Wala. Okay. Sige, so sila yung nag-prepare nitong presentation na ito, no? Okay. So they analyzed forwarded messages that circulated during the pandemic. Now, these are what we would probably call chain messages, at least during my time. And during the pandemic, different kinds of messages were sent and received from family, friends, and chat groups, no? Different chat groups. So part of their study involved the what and the whys of engaging in this kind of discursive exchanges. Okay, so this is their presentation.
Good morning, everyone. We are Danielle Casipit, PA Echague, Moira Tiongson, and Doms Cordero, here to present our research entitled Please Forward, an ethnographic analysis on messages circulating in social media or chain messages during the time of COVID-19. So before we proceed with everything, let us first define what exactly is a chain message. The traditional chain message centers on the idea of persuasion and connection. Its inherent purpose is to be exponentially forwarded to a predefined number of recipients in order to reach a goal. However, in recent years, especially now in the context of the pandemic, these forwarded messages are breaking away from the standard format, abandoning the usual explicit consequence of not passing on the text, and instead focusing on spreading a unified statement with an underlying agenda. With that in mind, our study aims to ask the following research questions, mainly, how do messages that circulated in social media or chain messages reflect views and experiences of the pandemic? And subsequently, we also ask, what are the different themes of these messages? what linguistic styles are used to convey the intent of the sender and or of these messages, and lastly, how does the linguistic style and the participant's context shape the perlocutionary effect of these messages?
So for the methodology, for our instruments, we chose to create a corpus compilation for our messages and have a semi-structured interview where we ask predetermined questions to our interviewees. In our data gathering procedures, we collected messages about COVID-19 that circulated in social media through asking our friends and group chats to send us such messages. We conducted a semi-structured interview with 4 informants through Zoom. In our ethical considerations, the written consent was asked from those who sent us messages, while the verbal consent was asked to the informants before beginning our interview. In safeguarding our informant identities, we gave them pseudonyms in our study.
For the analysis, we looked at chain messaging as a communicative act using Austin and Searle's speech act theory. We also looked into the locutionary act, illocutionary force, and the perlocutionary effect of these messages. And in order to further understand the context of these messages, we use Saville Troic's Ethnography of Communication as a framework to dive deeper into the illocutionary force. We particularly examined the register and style of the messages and the participants' context.
As mentioned, we analyzed our data using the speech act theory and the ethnography of communication. So following the speech act theory, we start with the locutionary act. We looked at the different themes that emerged from the chain messages that we gathered, such as vaccines, alternative or home remedies, religion, and reminders about COVID. Vaccines and the messages were discussed in both positive and negative lights. Some urged the recipients to get vaccinated as soon as possible, while others warned against it. Next, we have alternative or home remedies. These messages shared ways to prevent or even treat COVID at home, usually without medical assistance. These ranged from drinking warm water and inhaling steam to preparing COVID medical kits in case one gets infected. Messages falling under the theme of religion were also both positive and negative. Prayers for the end of the pandemic and healing of the sick were circulated, often referencing the Bible, as well as messages that claimed the virus was planned by the Antichrist and vaccines were the mark of the devil. Lastly, there were also several messages that cautioned recipients about the virus and the pandemic, often warning of the increasing number of cases or of new variants and ways to stay safe.
Next, we move on to the illocutionary force, which pertains to the meaning of the message or what the message wants the receiver to do as interpreted by the receiver. First, we look at the message's register and style and what these may index. In the performance of authenticity, some of the messages we collected made use of scientific or technical jargon. Here, the message mentions the PGH and the term paranasal sinus. The use of scientific jargon and claims that the original sender comes from the medical field makes the message appear more believable. Tito D, one of our informants, adds that, quote, if it's coming from a news agency or certain groups or sometimes a group of doctors, so you try to lead them also. You also see the name of the doctor, whoever na nag-research. If it's interesting enough and valid enough, I also try to validate it from other sources, end quote. For inciting a sense of urgency, the messages analyzed here identify with the function of speech events as a directive, that through language, people are made to do things. The following are 3 subcategories which appeared frequently in our data. In the urgency in saving others, the message's use of hurry indicates a plea in which this needs to be done at the soonest time possible. It shows that this pressing concern has to be shared in the interest of time and others. Saying save someone makes the message not only about the reader but also about people close to them. This appeals to their emotion because it makes the issue seem bigger than just the individual and that others are also involved. Sister M said that, quote, and then nga, I used to read, please share it at once, end quote. For the warning, this message has something to say about the near future. They are based on things that have possibly happened previously or things that have happened in another place. It is saying that since this has happened elsewhere, it could also happen to you. And lastly, for inciting fear, the mention of death does not mince words when it comes to scaring the reader into just how serious the situation is. One of the things humans fear most is death, so this is a wake-up call and also adds a layer of warning and urgency.
Lastly, we have encouraging messages, which also come in the form of directives. While they look to be hopeful and inspiring, they also come with an explicit call for action, which may be treated as the act of encouragement itself. In forwarding messages with this style, senders index an intent to be helpful and supportive to those they pass these on to. One of our informants, Tito D, mentions how, quote, mga pinapasa natin, nakakabigay ng pag-asa sa tao na walang pag-asa. Kung ano mang sinasabi niya, kung ano mang na-experience natin na alam nating makakatulong sa mga tao spiritually and sabihin nila lang emotionally most of the time, yun pinapasa natin yun para maka-encourage, unquote. Some messages aim to spread positivity through religion and prayer, while some give hope by utilizing a sense of community, mentioning how these messages could be some sort of help in these trying times.
We also examined the participants' context as part of the illocutionary force, looking at the receiver's relationship with the sender, how the message conforms with the receiver's beliefs, and how the message resonates with the receiver's experiences. The relationship between the sender and receiver is an important factor to how the receiver will react to messages. Tito D is quoted saying, "In reality, you have a lot of FB friends, but not all of them are close to you. So alam mo yung inner circle mo. Once they send you messages, you really tend to pay a little closer attention to it." End quote. When the messages are forwarded by people closer to the receiver, such as close friends or family, they are more likely to believe what the message says.
Another factor that may affect the illocutionary force is the participants' experiences and their values, such as their religion and social or political worldviews. We were able to collect chain messages that used references from the Christian religion. There are messages that are hopeful or encourage the receiver to pray for the end of the pandemic, and there are those that ask the receiver to thank God. Messages that debunk the existence of COVID-19 and discourage vaccination are also present. These messages usually use the Antichrist, also referred to as the Illuminati, from the book of Revelations in the Bible to explain that the pandemic was planned by the said group and that the vaccines are marks of the devil or 666. Passing of messages that use biblical references may appeal to the receiver's present knowledge about the religion. Their interpretation of the message may also be influenced by their religious beliefs. According to Sister M and Lola S, they base the decision making process on whether the chain message is true or not on the Holy Spirit and the Holy Bible. Next slide, please. Aside from religion, their social and political worldview may also affect the illocutionary force. Sister M shared that they have received messages which claim that the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccines are mere schemes of health and government institutions, such as the World Health Organization and the Department of Health of the Philippines, to lessen the population of the globe or as well as profit from the pandemic and the production of vaccines. We also collected messages that fall under the same theme. Messages that encourage the receiver to be skeptical and question the pandemic align with the interviewee's distrust of the said institutions. The interviewees that expressed distrust in government institutions were because of their observations and firsthand experience with the government's pandemic response and the Philippines' history with corruption. The illocutionary force may also be affected by the recipient's experiences. As I've mentioned earlier, the government's pandemic response influences the illocutionary force or how the recipient will interpret the message. Some of the interviewees revealed that they do not trust some of the government's decision and policies regarding COVID-19 and vaccination, similar to the topics of some chain messages we collected. Lola S. in particular conveyed her dismay on the disapproval of ivermectin and also doubted the government's procurement process on vaccines, saying that it is not well researched. Tito S. also doubted if there really are COVID-19 cases in their city, claiming that it may be a way for public officials to steal more funds from the people. Aside from the government's pandemic response, testimonies from friends and loved ones also affect the receiver's perception of the message, whether it's true or not.
The researchers collected many messages discouraging the receivers from getting vaccinated. According to Sister M, they were convinced by these messages. However, upon learning from other people that being vaccinated does not bring adverse side effects, unlike what the messages are trying to say, they changed their mind. Suob or inhaling of steam was also recommended by many chain messages we collected. Although this is not endorsed by health institutions as a cure to the virus, Tito S said that he forwards messages encouraging suob because they believe it is true. Tito S told us the story of how their brother and his family was cured of COVID-19 by only doing suob at home.
So the final part of Austin and Steele's communicative act is the perlocutionary effect, or the action taken by the receiver upon reading the message. Here, we will discuss the initial action, the act of forwarding, and the application to real life. For the initial reaction, the first thing the interviewees would do is to read and think about the messages they had just received. They also discern which messages deserve their attention and which do not. One of the interviewees, perhaps due to their religious background, prays over the message to ask for guidance. These initial actions could suggest that there is a careful deliberation process whenever the informants receive a message. We often think that people who participate in forwarding messages would do this without a second thought, but their interview responses prove otherwise.
When forwarding these messages, we also looked into if senders would edit or modify the content before sending. While none of the interviewees mentioned that they edited the messages they forwarded, there were a few noticeable instances in the ones we collected for our corpus. Most common among these were context providers or disclaimers made at the beginning of the messages as to whom or where the senders might have received the messages beforehand. This can be observed with statements like forwarded as received, don't know if it's true, or seems helpful, which imply a sense of reservation regarding the information and intent of the messages. Aside from these, there are also instances of additional reactions, which may provide some commentary on the content. These also have the possibility of making the message more interesting using emojis, which may be eye catching and may entice more of a reaction from the receiver of the message.
Interviewees were all influenced by the messages they received. Some started practicing home remedies promoted by these messages, such as steam inhalation or pagsuo and drinking warm water. Practices for quarantining and disinfecting were also circulated and put into use by the interviewees. For others, their attitudes were significantly shaped by the information forced through the messages. Perhaps the most notable are those surrounding vaccination, especially those meant to prevent COVID-19. Interviewees shared becoming hesitant and even fearful of getting vaccinated. However, these fears may not be definitive, as an interviewee who was initially unwilling later changed their mind. Beyond the information from actual messages, interviewees were also prompted to do their own research after receiving messages on a particular topic. Turning to the internet or medical professionals, they sought further knowledge to inform their attitudes and practices. These messages being forwarded to others at an exponential rate are a powerful vehicle for information and community. They carry within them the potential to shape discourse and action, which could be instrumental or detrimental to the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. After analyzing our findings and studying chain messages as a communicative act, our group determined the Big D discourse as follows. The recipient's interpretation of the message does not only come from the content of the message, it is also affected by other factors such as the participant's context, which includes their religious beliefs and sociopolitical worldview. The act of forwarding messages posits the sender and their values, principles, beliefs in alignment to the content of the message itself. As the sender forwards the message, they also tell the recipient that its contents align with their own sentiments and disposition. Subsequently, our interviews also revealed that readers of a chain message will only dwell and pass on messages that agree with what they already know. The register or style of the message that they deem acceptable also reflects the principles they value, how they evaluate which sources they consider reputable or trustworthy, or the weight they put on how a message itself is written in terms of language use, grammatical competence, and the like.
On the other hand, while the act of forwarding messages reflects the person's values, it also simultaneously acts as an extension of the sender's self. Language cannot be separated from its user, which is why the concepts of accountability and credibility are heavily tied to the act of forwarding we observed. Some of the interviewees expressed that they are particularly careful when forwarding messages, since these hold them liable to the information they share to other people. They also go the extra lengths to verify the content of these messages via more official sources online. Aside from being selective of what messages to send, senders also evaluate on who to send it to, essentially forming and maintaining systems of connections which allow only specific worldviews to perpetuate. Networks like these mark and maintains various social categories and divisions, and serve as platforms to identify other individuals who may share similar dispositions on the current situation. An understanding of these shared beliefs and values allows less space for judgment among receivers and more to be open about one's sentiments regarding the events of the pandemic.
Finally, the forwarded messages and its role in society consist of two aspects, community and relevance. Even though physical spaces have been limited, the senders' desire to reconnect with their loved ones and protect them from the pandemic allowed them to foster a sense of community online. Trade messages in our observation are rarely, if ever, forwarded out of malice, and always aim to provide aid and to be a helping hand to one's neighbor. Furthermore, messages and their effects are rooted in the unique experiences of a community brought about by the context of the by the context of the receiver and or sender and the experiences of those around them, like the experiences of our interviews with the government response on COVID-19 and their views on vaccination and so on. Finally, we observe that these forwarded messages are always relevant to the context they exist in. Before COVID-19, messages often did not have any specific themes and generally came in the form of jokes and prayers, but the pandemic has shifted its topics. This emphasizes how language cannot be removed from its contextual situation. And with this, the content of forwarded messages circulating during the pandemic reflect current issues and the overall social reality it is bound in. So that's it for our presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so hindi pala nakita yung yung group members kanina. So now I just want to reintroduce the members of the group to the public. PA Echague, Dominic Cordero, Moira Tiongson, and Danielle Casipit. Is Danielle here? Wala. Okay, so sila yung nag-prepare ng research na yan, gumawa ng research na yan. Okay, sige. Okay, so thank you, Danielle, PA, Moira, and Dominic. No? So before we continue, I just want to remind our participants to send their comments or questions in the chat box, or for our Facebook viewers, dun sa comment section. No? Place your comments and questions there. Okay, so our third presentation is on travel news headlines during the pandemic. Given the significance of mobility in our everyday lives, the group looked into how travel was discussed in the news during the pandemic, when traveling dramatically decreased and was severely hampered, by the lockdowns in the country. The title of the research is Discourse Analysis on the Travel News Headlines During the Time of COVID-19. And the members of the group are Jerrico, Calanog, Faye Castillo, Bryan, Pauchano, and Alyssandra, Alex Tantengco. No? So Bryan and sino ba? Bryan and Jerrico are here. Is that correct? And Faye. Okay, Faye is here. Ayan, sila. Okay, so let's have their presentation now.
Good day. For our presentation, we will be discussing our discourse analysis of the travel news headlines during the time of COVID-19. Here is the outline of our report. Mobility has been severely affected by the pandemic to curb the spread of COVID-19. Flights, both international and domestic, have been limited. Even interregional travel, as well as public transportation, have been banned during early 2020, where strict home quarantine protocols were implemented. In a May 2020 news article by CNBC, the reports that 217 countries have imposed travel restrictions. With this, our study will look at headlines focusing on travel to understand how it has been affected by the pandemic. So why headlines? Headlines are the first thing that readers see, and headlines can influence an individual to read or ignore a news article. Headlines also encompass what the news is about and sets the tone for the content. For our study, we will be referring to the news agency as NA for confidentiality. We chose this particular news agency because it is only based online, which means that it has a wide reach for readership. Furthermore, its image adheres to today's youth, who coincidentally also likes to travel. For a research question, what does language to travel news headlines say about human mobility during the pandemic? How were the decisions about word choice made in the context of the pandemic? What is the elocutionary force underlying the literary techniques used in the headlines? And what do the headlines suggest about the meaning of traveling and the social life of Filipinos?
So, for our research methods, we used headlines as our main material for analysis. We find this relevant to focus on because, as stated earlier, they summarize the angle of the news. These are the words that are most prominent when published across social media platforms, and they carry the weight of catching people's attention. In our research, we limit our collection to news headlines within the Philippine context during this pandemic. We also focus our time frame during the year of lockdown from when it started last March 2020 to the resurgence of lockdown recently, March 2021. Initially, we wanted to focus on non-COVID travel news, but during the course of data collection, it was almost impossible to separate COVID-19 news from travel during this time frame. And so, for our actual gathering, we collected travel headlines from the site's travel section and other tags such as Philippine tourism and aviation, to name a few. We used spreadsheet to compile and further organize them into sub-time frames, namely March to May 2020, where there were more travel bans and COVID-19 news cases, June to August 2020, when international tourism or businesses were starting to open, September to December 2020, where there was an easing of ban and the holiday season, and January 2021 to March 2021, where more easing up and the return of lockdown happened. We also labeled the headlines we gathered according to date, author, section, or tags, and categorized if they were soft or hard news. Finally, we took note if they were local news or international to further segregate them and observe the frequency of publishing of these news per time frame. And for these, we based our interview questions and selected our interviewees, which we had four. Some of them are editor, multimedia reporter, and correspondents who all come from NA. During the interviews, the main data points that we asked them were why do they have a news section on travel? How are travel headlines generated? These questions were adjusted per interview based on the role and the background of the specific resource person. All the information that we got from our interviews helped us confirm, correct, and develop our initial observations that we saw from headlines. And to make sense of all these data, we primarily use discourse analysis. It helped us document the prominent linguistic features used in news headlines, look at the situational context these were produced, and see the functional relationship between the two. In addition to this analysis, we also looked at speech act theory to look at the linguistic features specifically with the use of elocutionary force. With the help of our data from the interviews, we analyzed the intended message that writers and editors want to convey through headlines. With this, we got to further understand how the text or headlines and the context, which is during the pandemic, along with the social actors that produce them, work together in describing what headlines say about mobility during this pandemic. All these allowed us to see the bigger discourses that will be next presented in our findings.
So now, we're going to present the findings and analysis of our research. Mainly, we will be focusing on discussing three things, which include the themes, the linguistic features, and some of our other findings during our study. These findings will be used as evidence to our analysis of what these small discourses reveal about the big discourse surrounding travel. As a preface, we'd like to introduce the headline writing process to contextualize how these headlines are generated. This will answer the questions surrounding the people involved in the process and in what ways they are involved. From the result of our interview with editors, writers, and correspondents, we were able to find out that this particular news agency allows their writers to produce their own headlines. And as with other news agencies, they eventually pass through the editor before getting published. These editors may or may not consult with them about the possible changes in their headlines. They also do not have quotas, which reflects why the number of headlines we were able to gather vary in quantity. There are some months where we observe fewer stories produced compared to other months. They also consider an audience when writing their headlines. This is reflected in their choice of words that are easier to understand. We've also noticed that not all of their headlines in this travel section are produced by the writers, but instead they come from what they call as wires. These wires allow them to dispense articles and headlines through the subscribers' own channels. Here are some of the headlines that we were able to gather. These are some of the themes present in these headlines. Themes such as politics and economy were determined by categorizing the topics they discuss. These themes look at topics in a broader view. If we are to look closer, themes discussing economy include topics related to businesses and tourism. Politics, on the other hand, discusses topics including local and international policies and other relevant topics, including news involving government agencies. The most frequent and overarching theme to some of these headlines, however, is the topic of COVID 19. Now, how do we answer the question, what do these themes reveal about the topic of travel in the time of COVID 19? As we've seen from our sample news headlines, discourses about travel are usually interconnected with discourses about our current situation of travel amid the pandemic. The topic of travel is also interconnected with the situation of politics and businesses relevant to travel. From these themes, we can say that in every discussion of travel, the discussion of politics and economy is also relevant. This finding highlights travel as an essential part of our lives because of how much impact it has on our relationship with these sectors of society that dictate our mobility, livelihood, and more. Additionally, these themes reflect how these editors and writers experience travel amid the pandemic. As mentioned earlier, writers and correspondents are very free in their capacity to produce stories that they want to report. They write these stories and headlines through their observations of the online data, their gut feeling, and through their own judgment of what is relevant and what they feel is needed to be reported to the public. It is also noticeable that in these themes, the definition of travel differs. Travel in themes relevant to business would look at policies involving the Department of Tourism and its effects on certain business entities. Travel in themes relevant to politics looks at travel in terms of policies involving local and international mobility. Although there are differences in the way travel is discussed between themes, these themes also overlap. A primary example would be that themes of news discussing businesses and economy relevant to travel also fit with the theme of COVID 19. These findings strengthen just how interconnected these themes are when always discussing travel amid the pandemic.
Here are some example headlines for the linguistic features, which we will look into later. The type of phrasing used in news headlines is the active voice to ensure precision by making it clear to the reader who is taking action in the headline. It is used for direct invocation of messages of the text depending on the angling of the subject. Literary figures that are used in the headlines include personification of places. The articles mentioned are examples. Baguio City prepares to welcome tourists from Luzon, and Batangas opens dive site to tourists. They incorporate these city names as the doer of the action, which are Baguio and Batangas. In relation to this is the use of metonymy. As seen in these headlines, city or region names are used to substitute unfamiliar places.
Another feature is the choice of using words that incorporate familiarity with unfamiliar subjects to make it more recognizable to the audience. Interrogative and imperative mood also function in the headlines for direct connection with the audience. A sample headline is Miss Traveling, try this online mystery tour of the Philippines. Speech act theory goes into the literary figures mentioned. The people ought to experience the illocutionary effect intended by the writers or editors of the headlines. The illocutionary effects of these locutionary acts or the linguistic features are number one, personification of places, using city names as metonyms, and familiar nouns or places in lieu of unfamiliar is used with the intention of to make readers relate, recognize, connect, and give more engagement for readers to read the story. To intrigue the reader, compared to using terms that are unfamiliar with them. Number two, in addition to using city names as metonyms, it gives the locutionary force of to assert who has the power or control over travel and mobility, and to inform about location openings and travel policies instead to persuade. And lastly, interrogative and imperative becomes an approach to engage the readers into not only reading but interacting, trying, experiencing online traveling.
For our additional findings and analysis, given the examples of headlines mentioned earlier, we saw how headlines on travel during the pandemic became more concerned with reflecting COVID-19 policies, protocols, and what they want people to do, which is to stay indoors. More so, as we can see in these two headlines, because of the travel restrictions, discourse about travel during the pandemic is also talked about as an online activity. Through their words choices and even sentence structure, speech act theory also comes into play. Writers and editors make sure that travel headlines sound more neutral, economic, or business for their intention of discouraging travel during these times. And all these show how power emanates from the editorial process, where, with their conscious choice and use of words, they could influence how readers feel, think, and act towards traveling.
Given all these findings, we can see that the local understanding of travel is multifaceted. It is a relevant aspect in the lives of the Filipinos that not only touches on leisure, but also on economics, law, business, among other things. This importance and interconnectedness have been evident during this time of the pandemic. While writers have agency on how headlines are generated, they are also influenced by the readership and the national and local governments who control travel and mobility. Workings of power in writing these headlines could also be seen arising from the editorial process. With their conscious act of choosing what words, phrases, or literary devices to use, they could affect how readers perceive travel. At the same time, readers and the present conditions affect how editors and writers choose these linguistic features in generating headlines. All these affect and impart how the concept of travel during this pandemic. When limits on travel were imposed during the pandemic, there has been an extra emphasis on writing travel headlines straightforwardly, neutrally, and humanely that might implicate people's thoughts and actions to limit traveling and prevent the spread of COVID-19. Travel headlines have been frequent in using words that relate to laws, policies, transportation, or anything that would either make it angled to economic or business, yet at the same time must be familiar or known by the public. In the end, these news headlines reflect the experiences of the speech community with travel amid the pandemic. Travel, through our interaction with the news writing community and with our analysis, is understood as multifaceted, essential, and embedded in our way of living.
Okay. Thank you to Bryan and Faye who are here. Sorry, hindi na naman sila lumabas kanina. So, let's try kung lalabas sila ngayon. Are they here? Nakikita, ayan. Okay, so that's Faye and Bryan. Okay, thank you. Mamaya magsalita kayo sa open forum. Okay. So our last presentation is prepared by Marika Amaro, Garrick Nang, and Ruth Roque. Okay. So the group looked into common perceptions of terms that became part of our everyday vocabulary, such as isolation, quarantine, social distancing, and lockdown, if I remember correctly. So they gathered comments from Facebook to see what kind of discourses news items about these terms generated. Okay, so today we have joining us, Ruth is here, no, Ruth, and Garrick. Okay, Ruth and Garrick are here. Ayan. Okay, say hi. Okay, so here is their presentation.
Good day, everyone. We will be presenting a research project titled COVID Vocabulary and Analysis in the Philippine COVID-19 Situation through the use of multiple pandemic-related terms on Facebook. Next slide, please. So to start, we will be discussing two of the theories related to this topic, one of which is Franz Boas' statement that studying language is a means for understanding culture or could lead to the evidence on the ways people classify the world around them. In our case, discussions and engagements by the members of the virtual community of Facebook gives us a glimpse into their beliefs, understandings, and even their experiences in the COVID-19 pandemic. The second theory is Benjamin Lewer's statement that language shapes the thought or the way people think about certain things. In this case, the use of the terms on the page posts can affect people's understanding of the context of the news or announcements. Next slide, please. Now, to contextualize our study, we have to look into the current situation of our country during the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been said that the Philippines has one of the longest and strictest lockdowns in the world, with millions of reported cases and more than 20,000 related deaths. Authorities see the virus as an existential threat and an unseen enemy that we need to be at war with. This wartime imagery highlights the urgency to decide on policies like closing of schools and imposing travel bans and lockdowns. Next slide, please. This appeals to the citizens in a way that urges them to cooperate. And being uncooperative, like not wearing masks and face shields, violating curfew, and even refusing to get vaccinated leads to punitive actions. The people who do not and could not follow these newly imposed restrictions are called pasaway or matigas ang ulo. Although cooperation is a must, some Filipinos still find themselves confused, especially with the amount of COVID-19 related information that gets released every day. A possible cause of this confusion is the contradicting statements and actions by authorities, which include the COVID related terms being interchanged when used in public, as well as the increasing quarantine classifications being implemented in several areas around the country. Next slide, please. These restrictions are often announced through press conferences with news sites in the country, and currently, these news sites have their own Facebook pages where they share headlines and new announcements. This is because digital technology has been highly vital for the widespread dissemination of information and guidelines that are essential in dealing with the pandemic, especially since a lot of Filipinos have accounts on Facebook. In fact, according to Napoleon Cat, 65.3% of our population already uses Facebook. And within this virtual community, people may react and comment publicly and we can see the reactions and opinions of the people with the changes and updates regarding the pandemic through their comments. This leads us to our research questions. Next slide, please. What do the Facebook comments on the news posts suggest about how the common terms used during the pandemic, specifically lockdown, quarantine, social distancing, and isolation, were perceived by the Filipinos? And the next one, what were the general themes focused on by the comments of the posts that referred to quarantine, lockdown, isolation, and social distancing? Next slide, please. For our methodology, we will be talking about the data we collected, where we collected it from, how we collected it, and how we will analyze it in relation to our research questions. So first, for our data collection, the type of data we collected were comments that contain or talked about commonly used terms in the time of COVID-19, which are lockdown, quarantine, isolation, and social distancing. These comments were collected from the comment section of posts made by popular news sites on Facebook. Facebook was the chosen social media platform since a lot of Filipinos are Facebook users. The news sites were chosen based on their likes and in their respective Facebook pages. So the three chosen pages were ABS-CBN News, GMA News, and Enquirer.net. Posts from the pages were chosen based on the date they were posted, which has to be made within the first year of the implementation of the community quarantine on March 17, 2020 to March 17, 2021. And based on the content of the post, which has to be related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. We collected our data through an obtrusive observation of the comments that are posted online, but we made sure that the comments were unidentifiable by omitting the names of the people who made these comments. Our observations were unobtrusive since we did not interact with or ask questions about or respond to the comments we collected. Next slide, please. Consent messages were sent to the Facebook users, but only 5 responded, with 1 who said no and the other 4 said yes. Upon consulting Roxana Willis's work titled Observations Online, Finding the Ethical Boundaries of Facebook Research, we considered the technical accessibility of said comments and how the information in these comments were treated by the Facebook users themselves. Aside from the omission of their names, we also made sure that the comments were from a post that was set to public, since they were from posts of news sites, and that the information in their comments were actually meant to be accessible to the public, which are mostly inquiries, explanations, and suggestions that are related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. An interpretive analysis was conducted on the data we collected. This type of analysis would help us identify how people understood or reacted to the use of the 4 pandemic-related terms in news posts, and identify how the comments made online reflect the real-life experiences of Filipinos during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please.
So here we will discuss our findings. Again, just a reminder, the 3 news sites that we chose from Facebook were namely ABS-CBN, GMA, and Enquirer. And the 4 words that we focused on were quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and lockdown. Here we have the general themes that we observed across these 4 words. So first is the expression of preference for total lockdown. So there were comments that likened the implementation of a total lockdown as a sacrifice that we needed to make as a community as long as basic needs are provided by the government. Second, expressing confusion on the difference between terms lockdown and community quarantine. Some statements either express that they do not know the difference or that there is no difference between the 2 terms. Some also stated that quarantine classification should be removed to avoid confusion. Third, stating personal beliefs about the effectivity of lockdowns or quarantine. The Facebook users had varying opinions about terms, especially on lockdown and quarantine. Some of the prevalent comments talk about the following. First is that lockdown and quarantines are ineffective since there's still mobility in public is selective. Lockdowns are only needed to be implemented in selected areas, and continuous extensions of lockdown and quarantine prolongs the agony. Lockdowns are associated with the lack of resources. Some comments stated that the implementation of lockdowns could take away their sources of income and reduce their opportunities to provide for their families' essential needs. Some comments also expressed their disappointment over their local government units' COVID response. And lastly, suggesting other COVID-19 measures. Some comments focused more on suggestions in improving the existing COVID-19 measures on national and local level. Some suggestions are as follows: conducting programs for mass testing, urging fellow Filipinos to be more disciplined in following COVID-19 protocols, letting the military and the private sector help in our national COVID response, letting people go back to their respective hometowns to help reduce public distress, and creating a schedule for purchasing essential items outside that would potentially reduce the number of people in public spaces at the same time. So the first word that we focused on was quarantine, where we observed that the posts are usually on announcements and on the updates regarding the quarantine classifications. And then some specific common themes that are included are the expression of disappointment with the recurrent classifications, such as the switching between MECQ, GCQ, ECQ, and then the added various quarantine classifications. Next, expression of confusion with the various categorizations. As you have observed, we have ECQ, GCQ, but then the government never really gave us a proper fine line between what separated each of them. And then lastly is the affected livelihood because of the quarantine. Next is social distancing, where the posts are usually about events or personalities in violation of protocols like social distancing. Common themes include, but not limited to, expression of frustration with the kababayans who are matigas ang ulo, call for stricter implementation of protocols, and people should be blamed and not the government. Next is isolation. Posts are usually about the problems people face regarding the isolation facilities. And some themes include the use of COVID-19 as a business opportunity by medical and local officials. And a lot of these comments are personal anecdotes as to what they've seen and what they've experienced themselves in the quarantine, in the isolation facilities. And then lastly is lockdown, where the posts usually contain messages by the president threatening to impose more strict lockdowns. Common themes include the expression of frustration to the government, complaints on affected livelihood and subsistence, and the expression of varying opinions about the effectivity of lockdowns. These words generally are just ways of saying to stay where you currently are or to not go near other people. So according to CDC, quarantine is defined to be as the supposedly infected person or suspected to be infected person should stay away from other people to not infect other people. Social distancing is you stay away from each other to not infect other people. Isolation is there you are a bunch of sick group of people, or you are a person infected by COVID, and that you stay away from other people so they do not get infected. And a lockdown is just everyone in that area to just stay in place. If you've also observed, quarantine in the Philippines is a lot like lockdown, where it becomes a communal effort instead of something to be done individually. Here was the conclusion of our study. First is the reaction of the community was met with a lot of various feelings, such as anger, confusion, contempt, and disappointment. Also, there's a hint of hope were all present in the comments. COVID-related terms being interchangeably used by the government and by the media is mirrored by the public, which often leads to several misunderstandings and complications, which were also expressed by several users in their comments. The comments are reflective of people's sentiments on the COVID-19 situation in the Philippines, particularly on the longevity of the community quarantine implementation in several areas of the country. Comments also revealed that among different aspects of the social lives of Filipinos, their livelihood is the one that was greatly affected by the pandemic. Most of the comments were centered around their ability or lack thereof to acquire their essential needs due to the unemployment, reduced mobility, and the lack of assistance from the government. These also reveal how most people put the blame on the pasaways who do not cooperate with health protocols and the inadequate COVID response of the local government units of their respective areas for prolonging their agony in the time of pandemic. So that ends our presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Garrick and Ruth, who are here today. Okay, so those are our presentations. So now, hold on. Okay. So now we will have our open forum. So for our viewers on Facebook, don't hesitate to put in your comments and questions in the comment section. But in the meantime, no, habang siguro to start off our discussion, I want to ask my students, no, we discussed this a little bit during our class, but siguro it would also be good for them to share with you their own learnings, no, in doing research, doing their particular research projects, no. So what did they learn about either the subject matter or about studying language use, no? And to understand how people view or experience the pandemic. Okay, so sinong gustong mag-start? Maybe let's start with the first group. Sa pandemic parenting. Who wants to answer first? Ayan, si Alyssandra.
Ayun po. So aside from the things that we included in our presentation, of course po, through our study na pandemic parenting, I was able to, I'm po personally, karoon po ako ng insight about the point of view of parents and how they handle the pandemic po. And amazing po that through language use, through mga discourses po between parents and children, parang na-realize ko po na ayun po, na even though yung nararanasan po natin ngayon ay health crisis and in a crisis po, di ba, people tend to look out po only after themselves, but amazing po na yung mga parents po, it is an automatic response po talaga sa kanila to look after their children. Tapos makikita po talaga sa findings po namin na ina-adjust nila yung sarili nila, like yung speaking style po nila, pinapaintindi po talaga nila sa children nila yung do's and don'ts sa pandemic so that yung children nila will be protected po from the virus. Yun po.
Okay, Aundrei, you want to say something?
Ayun po, for me po, parang one thing I realized po is yung parang na-highlight yung there's no standard way or correct way in parenting or teaching your children. Kasi dun sa study namin, parang napansin namin na parang iba-iba sila ng way or manner kung paano nila ina-explain sa child or children nila yung mga dapat or hindi dapat gawin. So parang yun po yung isa po sa na-realize ko in conducting this research study po.
Oo, iba rin yung, it's also good to, I guess, understand, no, how parents kind of focus, no, on particular either topics or themes, and when they reiterate things to their kids, no, kasi syempre iba din yung parang diskurso natin, di ba, na naririnig and yung I guess the general discourse in public, but when it comes to translating, no, yung discourse na yun to children is also, I think, something that we need to understand, no? Okay. Sige, so sino yung next group? Okay, thank you, Alyssandra and Aundrei. Okay, can we have the next group? Kahit one or two from, I think, sa forwarded message, no?
Hi. Um, I think for our research, I think one of yung mga pinakalumitaw na parang moments of realization for me was na we entered kasi in doing this research with parang a preconceived notion of what we were trying to study, what we were trying to observe. And throughout the course of our parang ethnographic analysis nga, nagbago yung tingin namin dun sa data namin na dati nung initially we viewed these chain messages na parang we tagged them all as parang conspiracies or parang misconceptions, mga puro misinformation, but parang throughout the course of our research parang na-realize din namin after na syempre when doing research and especially ethnography, parang kailangan nga bitawan yung mga initial biases na ganito kasi the data na-observe namin, it really showed us a different side and a different perspective of how people viewed their experiences, especially ngayon sa pandemic, depending on their particular contexts. Ayun nga.
Okay. Thank you, Dominic. PA or Moira? Shy na? PA? Okay na? Okay na? Okay, sige. How about the next group?
Thank you.
Yung susunod nating group. Yan, si Bryan tsaka si Faye.
Hello po. So siguro start na din ako. Yung like before po nung parang nung research na to, akala namin for like yung travel is for leisure lang ganun. So siguro one of the main na natutunan namin and na-realize na yung travel, hindi talaga siya, like during these times, hindi talaga siya masiseparate from COVID and other like aspects of our lives. Like meron talagang nakadikit din na economic, business, nation, and other aspects na very important sa like buhay natin. So hindi lang siya pang leisure, ganun. And very important nga yung like yung pagiging isa in terms of journalism, like yung pagtingin sa yung pagiging human, yung pagiging aware of the power, since like malaki yung pwedeng maging effect nito sa like people na makakabasa.
Okay, Bryan?
Siguro po gusto ko na lang idagdag na yung pinaka-primary goal po ng pag-study namin ng travel is to, yun nga po, parang masabi kanina na i-understand talaga kung paano na pinag-uusapan yung travel ngayon since prominent na yung mga lockdowns, yung mga borders and whatnot. So, yung, yung mga na-find po namin kanina is yung parang, yun lang po din yung natutunan ko dun sa kung ano na yung nasasabi ng travel ngayon sa pandemic po.
Okay, sige, thank you. Then our last group, si Garrick at saka si Ruth.
Yung sa amin naman po, ma'am, I think it's interesting to see kung ano po yung mga thoughts or reactions na nako-connect nila pag nakikita po nila yung pag nababasa po pala nila yung mga posts regarding the terms quarantine, lockdown, social distancing, and isolation. I think it's interesting to see na iba't iba po, as in sobrang iba't iba po talaga yung mga reactions nila and kung ano po yung mga nadidiscuss nilang topics within the comment section. Like, for example po, may, like for the word lockdown, may mga nagsasabi po na it's a sacrifice that we need to make na kailangan po talaga ng total lockdown. Like, yun po yung pinaka-common na sinasabi nila. And at the same time, nako-connect po nila yung term na lockdown sa kawalan ng enough adequate resources. Like pag kunyari daw po, may mga nagsasabi din po na pag nag-lockdown naman, hindi sila magkakaroon ng chance na makakuha ng help from other people and from the local government, or kung mawawalan din po sila ng chance na makahanap ng trabaho or makakuha ng enough resources for their families, at least like enough for the time na kung gaano katagal po yung lockdown. And I think, yun nga po, it's interesting to see those things kasi sobrang malaman po yung discussions nila kahit na sobrang hindi naman po ganun karami yung mga nakuha naming comments. It's important din po na i-take into consideration natin yung mga sinasabi nila kasi hindi lang naman po yung yung discussions nila, hindi lang siya about their experiences, parang nagbibigay din po sila ng suggestions kung ano po yung pwedeng gawin, hindi lang ng local government units pero ng mga tao to help with the COVID response ng bansa natin. Yun po, ma'am.
Okay, Garrick?
I guess just to add lang po, it's interesting to see na parang with the concurrence of yung pandemic, we had more like we have like this vocabulary that we developed, and then unfortunately nga lang po medyo hindi siya like cohesive po yung definitions, pero it's just nice po to see na with rise of an event or like this yung pandemic, we developed like a new set of vocabulary that we get to use in our daily lives.
Okay, sige. We have a question from Facebook, no? May nag-comment from Giselle Miole. Parang estudyante ko ito dati. Sabi niya, research has become tricky and limited due to the ongoing pandemic situation. My question would be for everyone, okay, so maybe one per group can answer. What were the challenges you faced in conducting your research, and what did you do to address the limitations? Sige, can we have someone from the first group on pandemic parenting? Sino gustong sumagot? Yung challenges, no, of doing research in remote learning, no? Alyssandra or Aundrei, do you want to start? Or si PA muna? Ayan, nakita ko na kasi si PA eh. So, PA? Ayan.
I think isa po sa mga challenges namin sa chain messages research ay yung ethics. Sino ba yung hihingan namin ng consent sa pag-collect ng data? Kasi sino ba yung may-ari ng chain messages? Since pinagpasapasahan na nga siya, hindi possible na i-trace back doon sa original owner. So what we did is na humingi kami ng consent from those na nag-send sa amin. So kahit papaano na na-meet naman namin yung kailangan para makuha namin yung consent for that. Yun po.
Okay, sige. Other challenges? Sino pa?
Ayun po, to add din po, isa po din pong challenge that we faced was we were able to collect a lot of forwarded or chain messages from different sources. So challenge yung pag trim down which would we include in the research and which would we have to set aside first. So ang solution na inisip namin is gumawa po kami ng criteria on judging which messages we would be including. So in the criteria, we looked for kunyari yung message dapat meron po siyang hook, and then there's an explicit call to please forward this, and then of course yung different themes na nag-occur in the message. So yun yung mga tinignan namin so that we could further cut down on the number of messages that we can include in the study.
Okay. Dominic, you want to say something?
To add lang last for our group, naging hurdle din for us yung interviewing part namin kasi we had some interviewees na weren't familiar with Zoom or medyo nahihirapan to use social media on their own. So, medyo struggle din yun na we had to parang look for ways to overcome and parang assist them throughout the process para din maging involved sila. Tapos nagkaroon pa ng issue na hindi na record yung interview namin. So buti na nakapag-notes kami during the interview. And ayun. So, and syempre iba pa rin siya sa face-to-face na ethnographic research sana. Pero na-assure naman po kami ni Ma'am Monica na
No choice.
yes.
Sige. Anyone else would like to add to that from the other groups? Who wants? Yun, si Ruth. Ruth wants to say something.
Yung sa amin din po, may more on sa consent. Sa consent din po kami nahirapan since yung sa research namin, technically kailangan po namin mag-collect ng maraming comments. So, once nagsisend naman po, marami po kaming nasendan ng consent message sa Facebook since yun po yung chosen platform namin. Unfortunately, konti lang po yung nakapag-respond sa amin, like less than 10 lang po talaga. So we had to, medyo malapit na rin po, kailangan na po namin talaga mag-analyze ng data. So we had to consult a reading, to see kung ano po yung pwede namin gawin with the data, with the comments that we had. And nakita po namin na we had to consider kung paano, let's say, since public naman po yung mga comments na kinuha namin, we had to consider na lang kung paano po siya present sa public, kung as in meant for public discussion po talaga siya and talagang pwede siyang i-consume ng ibang tao since public post din po siya. And yun nga po, although sa simula naman po talaga in-assure namin na hindi namin isasama yung names ng mga nag-comment para rin po hindi ma-identify yung mga taong gumawa ng comments para rin po marespeto yung privacy nila. Yun po, ma'am.
Okay. Garrick?
Dadagdag lang konti. I feel like online ethnography or these it's different to yung online like research versus like face-to-face, whereas like when you ask someone, parang it's a straight up like yes or no agad, tapos like it's easier to move on and find a new informant rather than like yung sa online like kahit like hundreds and thousands of people na natrawan mo ng consent, like chances are 99% of the time hindi ka nila re-replyan.
Yes, oo. No? Yeah, challenge to because we were limited by the discourses that we could access at home, diba? So of course, a lot of those discourses were happening online. And in the case of yung forwarded messages, no, medyo ibang kaso naman because tama ba, you collected from your contacts, diba? Parang yung syempre, parang yung medyo purposive, no? Kasi na lang yung mga kakilala. And then you invited them to send you the messages, no. So yeah, it's a limitation, but I think you all did well, no. I hope you learned at least you started to learn the skills of doing interviews, no, and of course that whole process of asking permission, no. We also have a question kasi on ethics, and I think some of you discussed this, no, yung issues sa ethics. What we did, no, because a lot of the material was coming from these chat groups, no, Facebook, and basta online materials. Nag-prepare din kami ng parang short, parang consent message, no. Of course, we couldn't send the letters just to everyone, no, yung consent forms, but just a short kind of consent message. Na I don't know, did it fit in a tweet? I think it would fit in a tweet, but I think they sent it privately, to the individuals whose messages they wanted to include. So short lang siya, explaining, what they're doing, ganyan, para lang ma-inform sila, that that their messages are going to be used for the research. So yun yung isa sa mga ginawa namin early on. And yun na nga, katulad ng sabi ni Garrick, talagang mas malaki yung chance na hindi sila sasagot. So that was a big challenge, no? How about for the other groups? So what challenges did you face dun sa pandemic parenting? Ayan, si Aundrei.
Ayun po yung sa amin naman po. I guess it's normal naman po talaga sa research study na parang maraming changes na mangyayari. Pero yung sa amin po kasi parang nung una, parang kinailangan namin dapat mag-participant observation sa mga parents. Pero since online setup tayo, parang mahirap yun gawin ngayon. So, ayun, parang nagpalit kami ulit ng parang focus ng study na mag-focus na lang kami sa Facebook groups and then naging YouTube videos po, ganun. And then yung sa pag-reach out naman po dun sa parang mga i-interviewin namin, parang meron pong mga hindi sumagot na na kahit no man lang na hindi sila pumapayag na ma-interview, ganon. So parang ang ginawa na lang po namin is yung parang nag-interview na lang po kami ng parents na malapit po sa amin, na accessible po, para less inconvenience din po dun sa parang mag-login pa sila sa Zoom, ganon po.
Yes. Alyssandra, you want to add?
Ayun po. So actually po, kaya sa group po namin medyo nahirapan po kami maghanap ng focus. Kasi po parang nung una po, yung YouTube video po sana. Kaso po parang ni-reach out po namin yung mga content creators po sa mga video na yun. Tapos meron pong isang nag-reply. Ayun po. Tapos parang po dahil po dun po sa medyo delayed messages po, kasi syempre po remote po yung setup, ganyan. Kaya po parang binago din po namin na sa interview po mag-focus, tapos yun po, parang medyo pa iba-iba po. Yun po. Pero yun po, ang ginawa na lang po nga namin kung sino po yung malapit po na parent ng little children po.
Yeah, oo. Anyway, it was also one of the guidelines that I told them na kasi nga, we're constricted by the semester schedule. We really had to find, or at least you had to find topics that were feasible in terms of timeline and accessibility. So yun yun. But I think, I do like the topic. Gusto ko yung pandemic parenting kasi nga, translation yan. How do you translate it to kids, diba? Oo, sige. And then we have one more group, I think. Tama ba? Sa or did we cover everyone? Hindi, ayan. Isa pa, si headlines pala.
Hello po. Siguro in relation na rin din sa constraints sa time, din po kami nahirapan since kailangan malimit lang namin yung focus namin. So kaya din isang news site lang yung pinag-focusan namin. So siguro if more time and not in the pandemic, siguro we could have looked into it more, tas more aspects. Tapos but at the same time, kahit online siya, weirdly, ang daming data. So na-overwhelmed po kami sa di namin lang kami magpo-focus, ano yung method of analysis na gagamitin namin. So during the research, ganyan, medyo overwhelming din. Tapos siguro yung personally, pero feeling ko na feel din ng mga ka-groupmates ko na yung during interviews, since online lang siya, ang hirap ng mag-interview in the setup kasi minsan yung kausap namin ay naka picture lang. So hindi namin alam kung tapos na ba siya magsalita, so nangangapa lang talaga. So yung na-test talaga yung interviewing skills namin. Ganun.
Okay, good. In a one way. Bryan, you want to add something?
Okay naman na po.
Okay na. Okay, so we have another question. No? I think this is directed towards the, siguro directed to dun sa forwarded message na group, no, from Facebook, kay Markel Rivera. Sabi niya, hello po, good morning everyone, and congratulations po sa inyo. Ako si Markel James Rivera, estudyante ng BS Geography. May tanong ako. Ang tanong ko ay, saan po kaya nanggagaling ang conspiracy theories regarding COVID-19? Siguro, I think yung sa forwarded message and yung kina Garrick, no? Maybe you can try to answer this question. Sige.
Hello po.
Hello. Ay.
Ayun nga, I think we mentioned before na yung parang initial perception nga namin on chain messages was, ayun nga, lipa na sila ng mga conspiracy theories. Pero I think what came out of our data and from our observation and syempre yung sa usap namin dun sa mga interviewees namin was that yung mga messages na nagsicirculate na ganito, whether or not they can be considered conspiracies or not, are born out of contextual experience. So, parang people will share and people will reproduce messages na are in alignment with their own personal experiences and what their personal beliefs, principles, values are in life. And actually, hindi sila magpapasa ng mga messages na ganito if they don't believe in such a thing. So itong mga conspiracy theories na nagsispread through these messages, siguro we can look at them as products of experience. Like, for example, there are certain conspiracy theories na messages na pertain to yung parang yung 4G internet causing the virus and
5. Di ba 5G?
5G. Opo, ayan. So yung mga ganon, maybe they can in one way or another parang minsan natitrace sila back to ano ba yung mga personal experiences ng mga tao. Bakit ba nila sinishare to? Maybe sometimes, and even in our research, lumabas na yung mga nagsishare nito, meron silang distrust sa government, kaya may distrust sila in technology, in modern technology, may distrust sila in yung mga public healthcare systems na nag-govern over yung pag-address ng pandemic situation. Kaya nila sinishare yung mga ganitong mga information, kaya nila sinishare yung mga ganitong messages. Ayun, I hope that answered the question.
Yes. PA or Moira, you want to add something?
Add ko lang din po, ayun, we don't see it as conspiracy theories kasi parang, for example po, isang factor din na nakaka-apekto doon sa message na fino-forward nila ay yung religion. So, hindi natin pwedeng sabihin na misinformed sila if backed by the religion yung information na shinare nila. So, siguro po mas magandang tignan na by different truths doon sa mga tao when it comes to the perspective na meron sila about the pandemic.
Yes. Moira, you want to say something? Yeah. I guess we can also see this again as another issue. To me, no, parang again, it's an issue of translation. As we can, ngayong nakita natin yung discourses na na-generate, no? Ito nga yung mga so-called conspiracy theories. Ano nga ba yung unang sinabi? Conspiracy theory ba yung unang inano nyo? Or misinformation, di ba? Parang it's easy to say that coming from, let's say, I don't know, an academic perspective, or if you're, if you subscribe to the science, the dominant, a knowledge that is being spread, no, about the virus, kasi nga, it's coming from science. Dito natin nakikita na ang daming mga points of view. No? I mean, there exist so many kinds of ways of thinking, no, about viruses, about disease, illness, ganyan, no? Na syempre siguro hindi natin na-encounter before, no? Kasi kanya-kanyang buhay lang tayo, just go about our everyday life. But now it's spread, no? Kung we receive these messages, we see them almost everywhere. I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, yung WHO website, there was yung mga myths, di ba, about COVID. Dumami na ng dumami, no? Dati parang 4 lang yung myth na nandun until, it grew, no? And what I'm saying is that, yun na nga, ang daming lumabas, no? Na whether these are theories, perspectives. Now, again, no, as much as we would like to say, no, we have to believe in science, no? If we want this to end, we have to believe in the science. But if we want to do that, we also have to speak, no, to these different audiences and how, how to reach them and ask them, no, to or how to reach them in a way na magkaroon tayo ng konting meeting of the minds na kailangang matapos ang pandemic. At least on that level, hindi ba? But how do we do that? No, it's really, I think there's a lot of translation, or to me, a lot of translation that needs to be considered here. Whether it's the children or these different kinds of audiences also. No? Yung dun sa group ni Garrick at saka ni Ruth, I suppose, no, may lumabas bang mga conspiracy theories in relation to the 4 terms?
Yun nga po, nabanggit po nila na I wouldn't call them conspiracy theories. Siguro po, may mga comments lang po na hindi masyadong nade-discuss in a wider perspective, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
May mga ganun po kaming comments na encounter, pero yun nga rin po, siguro, yung importante rin nga po na tingnan yung mga yun since it's reflective of their experiences din po. Tsaka po kung ano yung na-absorb nilang information about the COVID-19 pandemic. Mas magandang approach din po yun to see kung ano po talaga yung naiisip nila and kung ano po yung what they meant with their statements. Kasi makikita din po natin kung ano pa po yung pwedeng i-discuss or ano po yung type ng information na pwede nating i-release sa public when it comes to the COVID-19 response ng either LGUs or ng national government and kung ano pa po yung pwedeng gawin natin as individual citizens for this particular public health issue. Yun po.
Garrick, you want to say something?
When I was going through yung sa comments, a lot of it were uninformed, parang declaration po nung mismong tao, parang sabi na then they'll claim like a certain like something, and then parang underneath like yung discussion, underneath his comment, like there's his or her comment, may discussion na parang kung ganito pala, parang nakakatakot kung like mangyari, like parang there was this one about the isolation facility. Someone got raped, if I'm not mistaken.
Got what? Sorry? Got what?
Rape.
Okay.
So parang ang discussion po under the comment section was natakot po yung pamilya na madaling parang COVID infected person doon, and they'd rather isolate them sa bahay rather than bring them to the facility. Parang ganun po. Like parang it's that like discussion na parang hindi siya fully like na-research po. It was like na-disseminate like through that comment section.
So there's really a lot of conversations happening on Facebook and I guess or on social media, and what we find is that we really have to be careful, no, in what we will consider as real, I suppose, no, a real information, in the sense corroborated, no, na totoo siya. And then of course there's the other thing which always runs through my mind. Ano ba yung motivation? What's well, in relation, I guess, to the yung sa news, no, yung what's the angle of telling, what is the angle here, no, why are people saying things, and in what way, di ba? Parang ano ba yung gusto nilang sabihin doon, no? Okay, sige. I think yun lang yung mga questions natin. Okay, so anyway, it's 11:50, so it's good to end here. No? Naku, thank you so much to my students, no? To everyone, and everyone who watched and viewed our program. Thank you so much. So this is the public presentation, no, of the Anthro 194 Research Methods in Linguistic Anthropology, no, public presentation of their researches, no, which is a part of our practice, no, of giving back to our participants, no, to show them that something happened, no, with the research. Marami tayong inabala dito sa ating mga projects, but yun na nga, hopefully it gave us some insight, no, into the different kinds of experiences of people here in our country, of the pandemic, no, of what happened. Okay, so again, thank you everyone who took time to attend and listen to the presentations. Thank you to my students who were very diligent. Ako na yung nalula sa mga pag-schedule na consultation. Hats off sa inyong sipag, no? This past semester. I did not expect that, but of course, I'm very happy about it. No? So thank you for all your hard work. Hope to see you in wala pa yata akong masyadong nami-meet sa kanila sa campus, no? Kasi ngayon naging student ko lang sila during the pandemic. Okay? So I also want to thank, no, our live transcriber, Dominic Revadulia, no? Yung kanyang tiyaga mag-transcribe. And of course, the technical assistance of Dominic Cordero and Moira Tiongson. No? Wala tayo sa Facebook ngayon kung wala sila. Okay, so this ends part 1 of studying these courses in the time of COVID, the public presentation of research projects for the course Anthro 194. I hope to see you this afternoon for part 2, which will feature projects from section THW. Okay, good afternoon. Afternoon na, good morning. Good morning pa, bet. Nearing afternoon. Okay, hope to see you later.